This is Lizzie Opiel, Vision Movement, and Israel is still engaged in a war against Hamas for almost a month and a half. And I'm sitting here in Jerusalem with Rabbi Yehuda Cohen.
Hi.
And we have a very interesting guest for this episode. Ariel Avidar is a former United States intelligence official, having served as a CIA case officer for over a decade. He's also worked in the U.S. defense industry and was formerly a U.S. diplomat. Ariel Avidar, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Yehuda. Great to be here.
Great to have you, Ariel. Now, for those listeners unfamiliar with what a CIA case officer does, according to the CIA website itself, their job is to clandestinely spot, assess, develop, recruit, and handle non-U.S. citizens with access to foreign intelligence vital to U.S. foreign policy and national security decision makers. Now, that's what's written on the website, what a CIA case officer does.
Yes.
If I were to dumb that down, I'd say a case officer's job is to recruit and run spies for the U.S. in other countries, and that these spies are not meant to be U.S. citizens and are therefore not protected by the benefits of U.S. citizenship.
And given that you're a former U.S. diplomat and CIA agent, and now you live here in Israel, and I'm told you spend your days studying Torah in Jerusalem and hold positions that are considered to be at odds with American regional interests, you probably have quite a story to tell. Is there any part of your personal journey that you'd like to share with our listeners before we get started?
Sure. So I guess I would like to add, I don't know if I would say at odds with U.S. interests necessarily, but what I would like to explain, and many of us have gone through this in this generation, previous generations, is that oftentimes we will see in our lifetimes that countries can change significantly. And we see differences in policies from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 100 years ago. And a lot of what I wanted to discuss when the two of you had graciously invited me here was to enlighten a lot of American Jewry and a lot of Israelis as well, that the United States is not the United States that we may have thought about 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're at odds in any way with the United States, but we should understand that things are different. And in the future, things are going to be very different. Now, of course, I'm not the only voice to explain this. I know there are others who I don't want to say warn is a strong word, but at least want to inform like I said, the Israeli public, the American Jewish public, that there are differences. And we're not living in the old days where we had blanket American public support. We're not living in the old days, and maybe Biden, we'll get into this, Biden is a throwback, even though, of course, he is on the side of the spectrum that is not as heavily, we would say Democrats are usually not as in favor and in supportive of Israel. But 40, 50 years ago, which is, again, Biden is up there, when he was around, during his time, bipartisan Israel support was pretty common.
Yeah, I'm going to throw out a radical suggestion here. My perspective is that the United States was never what we would call on Israel's side. I think the U.S. has always been on the side of the U.S., and that sometimes that can be expressed in a way that appears pro-Israel. Sometimes that can be expressed in a way that appears pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab. Just like when the British were here. When the British were occupying our land, they would do things that would appear to Arabs as pro-Zionist and things that would appear to the Jews as pro-Arab, but the British were really consistently pro-British imperial interests. And I don't think the US is any different. I do think that the American public has shifted quite a bit over the last couple of decades in terms of how they see this conflict. And therefore, there might be different pressures from below in terms of what a politician might feel coming from the voters. But in terms of the actual U.S. power structure, I just don't think anything has really changed significantly.
I would agree for the most part with that, Yehuda. Yes, the United States will look out for the United States' interest, as well it should, and as does every other country. If we could sum it up, I would say for the most part, over the past, again, this is making large stretches and guesses, and it's a broad brush, but for the most part, the United States has seen Israel as less difficult, less of a problem than the Palestinians or the Arabs when the conflict was a little bit more broad. whether you could relate to it as a democracy and whether you could relate to the people and a lot of the ideals that the people hold.
Well, I definitely think it's easier for the United States to relate to Israel in the way that Israel has presented themselves thus far on a global stage, meaning the messaging that we use to explain what we're doing here and the, types of, like you said, like viewing us as a democracy versus, the Palestinians, who I guess they don't really view as sharing the same type of values or, potentially being cooperative to the kind of goals that America has in the Middle East. It does make more sense that they would have aligned themselves with Israel up until this point.
I agree.
I first wanted to touch on, Israel's been at war with Hamas since Hamas committed a horrific massacre against us on October the 7th and took over 200 of our people as hostages into Gaza. Did you have any thoughts on how Israel's been fighting this war or our government's wartime strategy?
Sure. In terms of the security, and we've heard many times, there was a tremendous security failure. There was a tremendous intelligence failure that day. And I would say that is a complete understatement. When we say something failed, I think that means we expected it to go right. But when we talk about what happened that day, we literally had thousands of people, fighters, civilians, if we saw the videos, old people on bicycles, old men, who were entering what should be one of the most secure borders in the entire world. It should be monitored. These things go without saying. We don't have to get into the wall itself. But the fact that when Hamas came in, when the civilians, if we could call, when the other Gazans came in, when they entered, they came in with extensive plans. They said, we're going, as everybody knows, we're going to this kibbutz, and we're going to that kibbutz. And when we go there, I think they had plans to take over and hold certain areas of the south. So if they were to make such a plan, say, for example, I said, Lizzie, tomorrow we're going to break into Fort Knox. Or for those who don't know what that is, we're going to break into the Knesset. Okay. Yehuda, come too. But make sure you bring your toothbrush, bring a towel, bring something to make lunch. And you'll say to me, Ariel, excuse me, you plan to break into Fort Knox. You plan to break into the Knesset. What makes you think that you are so secure in your ability to get in that you could start planning for the next 2 weeks? So apparently, if you understand, see the analogy there, apparently Hamas getting past the border and getting inside and coming and going in and back and forth and taking hostages at their free will for hours was already a given. They already knew that they could get in and they could get out. So that is not the result of a failed camera, of a failed system of the wall. That means that we have to worry, we as Israelis, we the Israeli public, we the Israeli security system, we have to worry that our entire perception and our entire understanding of how secure our border, at least the southern border, but it makes us question everything, obviously. But we have to question what we have heard and what we've understood to this day. It could be a complete fallacy. Now, it could very well be that not that it's intentional. It could very well be, and probably is, that the security forces, the army, the intelligence agencies, they were for sure similarly shocked at what happened in the scale. But it seems like Hamas and those in Gaza were not shocked because they had pre-planned coming in and doing extensive damage, extensive work, well beyond merely getting past the wall.
Right. And, I've heard from several different accounts that the soldiers stationed at the border of Gaza had been noticing for quite some time already before this attack happened that, Hamas was actively planning something and there was actively, something going on, taking notes, gathering intelligence, and they pretty much were not able to respond in any capacity. So it requires an inquiry, that goes without saying. But in terms of how we've responded, how do you think that's going? Do you think we're doing well? Do you think the messaging is good? What do you think of this strategy that we're taking?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in order to, of course, the response is going to be very, very difficult. And the reason is, when we talk about Gaza, obviously, we're talking about ground warfare. We're talking about entering a city where every single corner, every block, every building is a hazard. We're talking about a place that has been ready and preparing for this for decades. They've been waiting. Everything is going to be booby-trapped, and there are going to be IEDs, and they've been waiting for this for a very long time. So this has to be, of course, very much tempered in terms of the response. So far, what they've done, from my understanding, is, and from what we've seen in the news, they've pretty much cut Gaza in half and will isolate the north. To what degree they're inside the urban areas, I don't think they're going to tell us. I can't imagine they're going to go in too deep, again, because there are examples of Fallujah and other previous, and when the Americans were here, when the American generals were here, they came specifically to discuss the difficulties of such urban warfare. Now, when we talk about other cities, none of those cities very few cities have been entrenched like Gaza is. Gaza's been entrenched and waiting for this. So far it seems so good, but I don't know if they've really gone so far deep into the urban areas. I don't know if they will. So that we'll have to see. A second element when we start to discuss strategy is that we could go over. We could say, well, if I were in Bibi's situation, I would do X, Y, Z. But there are a lot of unknowns that are very difficult for us to understand. And what I would say is, for the most part, we don't know what goes on behind closed doors when the Americans come, when Blinken comes, and he may say, listen, and there were reports about this, if you do this, we will stop X, Y, Z widgets, bullets, armaments, and something that may be necessary. This is something we've seen the Americans do in the distant past, or maybe not so distant past, with Obama. Obviously, with Kissinger, there's similar stories abound. So it's very difficult to really say what we would do if we were in that situation and to second guess the military operations, because we don't know what the pressures are in that sense.
Right.
Now, one thing I think that has become very clear is that from the Israeli perspective, this war is not about the hostages. Meaning that, had they taken 3 hostages or even 10 hostages, we would really be agonizing over how do we get these hostages back. The war aim would be how do we get the hostages back. But I think by taking over 200 hostages, what Hamas essentially did was force Israel into a situation where we have to devalue the hostage, each hostage, meaning that we can't behave as if they have 240 Gilad Shalits, meaning we can't be willing to pay the price that we paid for Gilad Shalit 240 times. We basically have to make the hostages irrelevant, because what we really need to do, and I think this is the thinking of our leadership right now, is we have to completely obliterate Hamas so they never take another hostage again, even if that costs us the hostages they have right now.
That kind of brings me into my next question, which is about the hostages. Hamas seems to be getting their asses handed to them in Gaza. So what kind of leverage do you think these hostages give them at this point in time, given what Rav Yehuda just pointed out about how Israel is going about dealing with them?
So in terms of what's going on so far, and what we Israel have been doing to Hamas, I would say we don't really know. And the reason why is that every day on the news we'll hear, and it's for us, the Israeli citizens, but it's also for Western consumption. And Israel, the government, is telling us we've taken out this many targets, and 6,000 targets today and 8,000 tomorrow, and we've used this much munitions, but we don't know what that really means, right? If I say to you, Lizzie, okay, we're going to use 3,000 today, and you're going to say 5,000 tomorrow, and we think we're successful, but we don't know what that means. What are they actually blowing up, right? Now, we're fighting against people, but we don't have the numbers of the people that are being killed, right? The buildings and the sand. If we sit and blow up sand all day, how successful are we? If we're getting a lot of images that seem to show success, but I would say we don't really know. It could very well be it is successful, and I would hope it is, but we don't really know. Now, the leverage of the hostages, this was their intent, obviously. They said, Hamas, they had marching orders to go and bring back hostages, to take, from what I heard, although different accounts, of course, to kill the men and take the women and children. Now, of course, when you start taking babies and you start to go to the level that they did with the atrocities, and moreover, because the atrocities, we've heard such things, believe it or not. For our generation, maybe we haven't heard it as often, but if you look back at the massacres in Hebron and other massacres, we've heard such things. But what we haven't seen is the intentional broadcast of it, the live stream, putting it on TV, intentional to show everyone. And I think that more so put Israel in a situation, even more so than the hostages, where Israel must act for its own public, for the political future of all of its leaders, and even for the world, where they're put in a situation where they must act.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the imagery really shocked a lot of Israeli society, really a lot of the world. But the point I was making earlier is that the sheer number, the number of hostages took, makes it impossible for us to be willing to really negotiate for them at this point. Like they can, maybe if they want to, retreat out of the country and leave the hostages behind, we'll let them go. But I don't see us being willing to really stop this war until Hamas is destroyed, at least destroyed here in our country.
Right. I would tend to agree. I think that at this point, like you pointed out, the sheer trauma that the Israeli public has gone through based on how horrific the massacre actually was, Israel kind of needs to pursue like a really decisive victory here. And I think that, like we just discussed earlier, given how difficult urban warfare really is, it's harder to justify, a ceasefire or a pause where we give Hamas time to actually like recoup and re-strategize when we're deep in Gaza and like carrying out a military campaign, even though there's such a large number of our people there. At this point, I don't know that like the Israeli government's hands seem to be a little bit tied in what they're actually willing to do.
I would agree with that, and I would add to that though, I don't think we've seen the worst of the fighting yet, unfortunately. When we do have to go deep, and again, I could be wrong, right? We don't know exactly what is being published, how much is true. I would hope it's that there is some level of intentional manipulation by the Israeli government, by the Israeli military to form the picture that they're putting out. But if in the next few weeks, God forbid, we should hear that every 2 days, every day we have a personnel carrier, God forbid, again with 15 soldiers in it, 20 soldiers. What if we start mounting casualties on our side in very significant numbers? We can't forget in Lebanon, that's what started to happen. So we have to remember Gaza also, unlike areas in Yehudan, Shomron, what some people know as the West Bank, those are relatively closed areas. So when you go fighting into Jenin, they're going to be limited in terms of what they're going to have access to, the weaponry. But Gaza, as we know, is able to be accessed from tunnels to Egypt. There are other ways to get much better machinery, much better weaponry into the territory. So again, I would love to be wrong on this, but it is very possible that we will have much tougher days to come when we go deeper inside.
Yeah, another part of this, and we've discussed this before on the show, is that Hamas fights Israel using anti-colonial tactics, meaning that because in the Palestinian narrative, the character of Israel is one of a settler colony, meaning the way the Palestinians and most of their supporters around the world view the state of Israel and Israelis as a settler presence in Palestine that can be defeated by making the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation. That's how we defeated the British in the 1940s. That's how the Algerians defeated the French. That's how the Afghans defeated the Americans. That's how many other countries in the global South have been able to rid themselves of their colonizers. And it's an effective strategy most of the time. The problem is we are not that. We're actually not what they think we are in their movie. And therefore, when they attack us and use tactics based on their fantasy of us rather than who we really are, their tactics are really doomed to failure. And that's what we see happening. So even if they don't want to accept, even if somebody wants to argue, no, the Jewish people are not an indigenous people in this land, we're not native to this land, either way, we self-identify as if we are. We think we are, we believe we are, and therefore we fight as if we are. And when we feel threatened in the way that we do feel threatened right now, and the way that we did feel threatened on Simchat Torah and in the days afterwards, we'll fight like a native people that feels threatened but has superior firepower. And I think that one thing we have to understand, we've spoken before about how violence is a language. And what kind of violence is Israel using in this campaign? And is that the type of violence that can change who we are in the Palestinian narrative? Meaning, when any oppressed people, when any colonized people fights their colonizer, part of their anti-colonial tactic is their own casualties. meaning how many Palestinians Israel kills from Hamas's perspective might actually be a benefit. Until now, Israel has been pursuing Hamas mercilessly. It's true, clearly, we've taken out a lot of Palestinian civilians in the course of doing so. I know that now, because of the stage of the war we're at, Israel is able to make more humanitarian gestures than it was a couple of weeks ago. Israel's just more in a position now to make meaningful humanitarian gestures for the Palestinian civilian. But even that, from the perspective of Hamas, I'm not even saying this critically. It was the same for the Algerians when they fought the French. Mounting casualties on the side of the colonized, on the side of the freedom fighters, is something that often forces the colonizer to confront certain contradictions in its own behavior and ultimately retreat. So that's not going to work on us. In fact, I think we have no choice at this point but to double down. Even with international pressure, I think that might be Hamas's last card. I think that they might be hoping for some kind of international pressure on Israel if this conflict lasts longer than we expect it to, and that might save them. But I really think that at this point, Israel has no choice but to go all out until Hamas is erased from our country.
Speaking of international pressure, I'm curious. I know I probably have my own thoughts on this, but I'm very curious to hear yours. Do you think that there's a scenario where American or international pressure could actually save Hamas from Israel?
Absolutely, I think there is. And I would read that from our leadership. Before I get to that, I do want to touch just on one point that Yehuda made in terms of the power over that we as Israel have over Gaza and other areas, where literally, as we heard a few weeks ago when we were discussing energy and how much fuel they would have in Gaza, and I want to just frame it in terms of other conflicts in the world, there are probably very few, or if any, where one side has such a dominant power over the other, meaning everything is in Israel's hands. Israel controls not only the security and the intelligence, we're talking about electric, water. They can't flush a toilet or turn on a light in Gaza without Israel's authorization. Now, money going in, everything that goes in, that goes out, it's completely in Israel's hands. If Israel wants to literally wipe it out, it could do so. If Israel wants it, meaning if we took away the international pressure that we're discussing. So the international pressure is completely probably the number one goal that Hamas is ready to use, and I think so far we've seen it historically with in the entire Israel-Palestine conflict, and we've also seen it from Israeli leaders, particularly if we want to discuss Bibi, for example. Bibi's pretty much his MO has been, and not to say it's good or bad, but obviously we're all the beneficiaries of it has been to keep the country economically successful. The global success that Israel has had goes without saying. Now, what is that based upon? It's based upon Bibi's work for, I would say, over 20 years of deciding that I'm going to keep these conflicts, whether it's in the south, whether it's in the north, whether it's Yehuda and Shomron, I'm going to keep these tolerable. I understand we will continue to suffer from it to some degree, but for the sake of economic stability, for the sake of moving the country forward, and for the sake of our image. Now, again, what we saw a few weeks ago was devastating in every regard, and it's putting Bibi in a position where he has to act a little bit more. But to be honest, what can happen is as time goes by, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, people get tired. The press move on to something else. The mobilized soldiers get tired, and even the consumers, the consumers in the United States, in Israel, those who are seeing the news nonstop, we get tired. So I could see a situation where using hostages, unfortunately, because Yehuda said we have to go in and finish with Hamas. Everybody's saying that now, but then when we get 6 months in and they start to trickle hostages out, will we start to hear a narrative of, well, maybe not destroy Hamas, but Hamas's capabilities are pretty much negated. We've defeated this whole list of leaders. If anybody remembers from the time of the Gulf War, we had a whole list. I'm sorry, not the Gulf War, but with ISIS, we had a whole list of playing cards of these leaders were taken out and those leaders were taken out, and that was our measure of success, including George Bush coming and going on the aircraft carrier, I believe it was, saying now we declare the end of hostilities. So a lot of it is depends on how things can be framed, and they can be framed very, very differently from what the reality is on the ground.
Right. But that could also work in our favor. Once we have a security presence in Gaza that the international community, might want to see as temporary, but it's kind of, reconciled itself to, because Israel's there, Israel doesn't have an alternative. I mean, right now, all of our security experts are desperate to find a solution other than Israel controlling Gaza and Israeli boots on the ground in Gaza. And there is no other solution, meaning the only way for us to be able to keep our country safe, especially the south of our country, is to have Gaza, is for Gaza to be controlled fully by Israel. And maybe the security experts will find something that will kind of sort of work and close the gap between what we know we need and what the Americans are demanding. But what I assume will happen is we'll be on the ground, we'll say it's temporary, the press will move on, as you said, and we'll just stay there until I hope there's enough agitation for us to go back in and rebuild the Jewish communities that were destroyed in 2005.
So what we've seen, again, with Bibi's MO is that could very well be what Yehuda just said, what very well could be the case. But in terms of what Bibi says and what Bibi will eventually do is very difficult to put those two together. And that's by design and by intent. Bibi is a very savvy and has been a very savvy politician, and that's why he's been around for a very long time. And his MO often is to use plausible deniability, where he'll say, listen, Yehuda, I promised you XYZ not too long ago. I would love to fulfill XYZ, just as I said, but now I have pressure from Lizzie to do so and so, so therefore I can't do it. And you just replace the names with whether it's Gantz, whether it's the right wing, whether it's the Americans, whether it's so and so. So what Bibi says today, again, this is not to say it's anything conniving. This is how politicians operate. So we could hear today, and this is in our case what he's doing, I think, with the Americans. He knows that we need American military support, at least to this point, for weaponry. I would assume. I'm not privy to any additional information on that. But we do need, of course, to some degree, to replenish everything that we use. So he could say to the Americans, yes, Blinken, I agree with everything you say. And then, of course, come down the road when the road is, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, they'll say, look, I said it then, I believed it then, I meant it then. However, XYZ means I can't do so and so. And that's, again, to our benefit or to our detriment, depending on what side we're on.
Right. That's very accurate. I think right now, we can all theorize about the direction that Bibi's heading in. I know I have my hopes about what he's going to eventually do, which is actually take responsibility for Gaza and, reassure those residents of the communities that were really hit the worst by this, that they can actually go safely home. But you're right. He does have to worry about the U.S. in this equation. So speaking of the U.S. and their support, when this whole thing first started to unfold, the U.S. administration came out in full booming support towards Israel in its messaging, and even sent warships to the region in a move that made a lot of Israelis feel that the U.S. has our back. So how would you understand these moves by the Biden administration, and what do you think is actually motivating Washington's behavior here right now?
Right. So that's actually an excellent question. And really, when we start to look at this, to try to assess what are they up to? What does the United States want? What is their goal? Right. So we have to look at different elements of it. What are their concerns? What are their red lights? What's going on here? So I think, as you accurately said, when the war first broke out, and all of a sudden we see an aircraft carrier, 2 aircraft carriers, right? And I've spoke to some the native-born Israelis who said, "Wow, look at the Americans! They're coming to support us again." But obviously, if you look a little bit deeper, you have to say, "What do I need an aircraft carrier for?" Right? Yehuda, come help me hammer in a nail, and you're going to bring a humongous saw. What's the relevance, right? It's a little bit overkill. So when we start to assess what are they bringing in these aircraft carriers for? Now, the first impression has to be, okay, well, we're at war with Hamas. We're in potentially at war with Hezbollah. So these aircraft carriers, which come, of course, with tons of war power, soldiers and all the ships that come with them. So we say, what are they coming? What are they here for? Now, frankly, a lot of the power that they bring is redundant. Right? And we don't need additional aircraft in this case, which is very different. And we should be thankful about this. Again, to put everything into perspective, don't forget, in this war, we don't have, and people will say otherwise, but we don't have the existential threat that we've had in the past. Hamas and Hezbollah combined to how many tanks and airplanes? Zero, right? Every other war or previous wars we've been in, we had gone against countries that had aircraft and tanks, and these are bona fide armies. We're not dealing with the same things that we did in the past. So Israel has complete control of the skies, and really to bring additional planes, I don't know what the benefit is there. So other people have said, well, you know what? And sorry, just back on that point, is also the U.S. said they're not sending any troops inside. Now there have been rumors maybe they're going to go in hostage, but for the most part, Biden has said we're not putting troops on the ground. So the second thing you could say, well, maybe it's for Iran. Maybe the presence is for Iran, which is what we've also heard. Now, there you would say, okay, well, if the presence is for Iran, against 2 aircraft carriers is a tremendous amount, then why not put it in the Straits of Hormuz? That's the first thing you have to wonder. Put it next to Iran. Put it closer, where you could actually, which would be the field that would be necessary. Now, keep in mind, in the previous American administration, when the Trump administration went and they publicly assassinated Soleimani, who was a very, very popular Iranian general, in front of everyone. He went to, I believe he was in the airport in Iraq, and they assassinated him publicly. So if Iran were to react to the United States, to any kind of provocation, if you want to call it that, that would have been the time. So from that, and given Iran's internal struggles that they've had going on now for decades, I don't get the impression they're looking to really go to war. But again, we're looking at the American reason for coming here with these aircraft carriers. So other reasons, well, they want to defend us from Yemen and other areas. But again, that is not, it's also a redundant power. As we've seen, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, they have the ability to knock down anything that Yemen is shooting at us. So what is it here for? And I think we have to look a little bit more globally to start to answer this question. The main reason I would say is the main audience for this is China. Within 1 week, the United States showed that they can mobilize 2 aircraft carriers across the world and all the resources that go with it. Now, China has 2, maybe 3, I don't know, 3 aircraft carriers in its entire fleet. I would say that one of the messages, not only one message, but one of the messages that the benefits that the United States saw here was an ability to send a message to China to say, listen, if necessary, if you decide to make any action against Taiwan within 1 week, we can move enough firepower to directly challenge you. So that I would say is one element. A second element, again, looking more broadly, is Russia. Russia over the past, I would say, since the Obama administration has really taken a foothold in the Middle East. That's clear. And one element here is the Biden administration and the United States trying to reestablish its superiority in the Middle East as the superpower of the world. Now, of course, you'll say, wait, Ariel, well, I think you forgot about Gaza. This is not what we're talking about. So yes, there is of course an element of Gaza, but I don't think it's to defend Israel from Gaza. I don't think, like we said, that's a redundant power. It's not a necessary power. I would imagine if I could sit in the White House and see the discussions that they had that day, they maybe woke up Joe. And they said, hey, Joe, you have to hear what's going on. XYZ showed him a few pictures, and they said, oh my goodness, Bibi is going to flatten Gaza. And we can't have that for a whole number of reasons. That can't be. But nonetheless, what did they respond? And I think it's a pretty ingenious response that they did do, which is, I would say, almost like a mafia style coming in. They partnered with Bibi. And not that Bibi was unwilling. Now, the first day, Bibi's